all help me welcome Vikram Saksena, who is the CTO of Sonus Networks. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's difficult to be the last speaker between, the cocktail and the talk. So I'll try to be quick and hopefully make some interesting points. As Rich said, I'll try to take the service provider point of view. Sonus for the last 10 years has been quite successful in helping service providers around the world build next generation IP networks. And of course, the initial game was voice over IP as the first big IP application to roll on a IP infrastructure. But very much now, I think the game is changing to, as we all recognize, to more multimedia and so-called broadband services. While many of folks on the internet side might want to think that the service providers are going to be relegated to dumb pipes and so on, the reality is that's not the case. I mean, clearly the business models are changing and the infrastructures are changing. So a lot of the way they used to do business is evolving and changing, but they're certainly not going to go away or become relegated to a commodity bandwidth providers. There is a lot of innovation going on quietly in the background. I don't think there is a lot of talk about it, and slowly things are happening in their space. And I'll try to give you a glimpse of some of the themes that I see working with the service providers and working very closely with them in trying to innovate in this particular space. Okay, so there are four major themes that I want to touch about in terms of how the service providers are thinking. The first one, of course, is broadband, which is really where a lot of the investments are going in making sure that the last mile infrastructure is going to be capable of delivering multimedia services. And that's sort of like the fundamental foundation. The next major theme, which I think is really came because of service providers and mobile operators, is the fact that there is ubiquity now in terms of mobility services and wireless services. They've become pretty much ubiquitous, starting with 2G and 3G and slowly moving to 4G. And it's not mobility just in the sense of having a mobile device, but it's also this whole notion of services that follow the user concept. And that is becoming very prominent, especially with IP and mobile data services, that you can access your package of services anywhere around the world because the data networks, the data roaming networking in mobile carriers is becoming very widespread and proliferate. So that's becoming a very major theme. So even internationally, if you have a data service, you can go to another country and access your profile. The third major concept is what we call the notion of convergence. Now, convergence, you can think about it in many different ways, but the way that carriers are now thinking about is the fact that, again, this horizontal decoupling idea that decouple the services from the device and the access networks. Now, that's a concept that is being embraced by carriers around the world, and that offers a lot of advantages, not only to end users and internet service providers, but also to carriers themselves, because now they can create services once and deliver it anywhere over their any access network. So that's a very important concept. Now, finally, I think the real value creation is going to happen, I believe, in this notion of personalization. And I think this is where creating and delivering services that are tailored to an individual's lifestyle has a very powerful concept. And this, what I will talk about at the end of my presentation is what are the implications for the infrastructure in order to be enabled to enable this. And this is an area where I think it's very prime for innovation in the service provider space. So let me start with broadband. And if you really think about what's driving the growth for broadband services, it's really three factors. The first one, of course, is the demographics. And this is driven by what we all come to know as the internet generation. So the appetite for new services is really being created by your children and mine who have adopted a very different style of communication. If the world only consisted of people like us, you probably wouldn't have had so much innovation. So it's not just creating services, but you need on the other side a desire to consume these services and to experiment with these services. And this is what we learned from the younger generation, that their willingness to experiment and adopt communication lifestyle is spurring this innovation. The second major factor is devices. In the early days, back in the PSTN days, of course, it was all about the network and nothing about devices, because the device is very, very simple and connect to the network. But now I think there is a balance now between the network and devices. The devices have become very smart and intelligent on a lot of functionality, which is very much driving user adoption for these services. So carriers are very much cognizant of the fact that the role that devices play in service adoption is a very critical factor. And finally, of course, the demand in terms of content and applications, which are primarily coming from the internet, but are delivered over carrier infrastructures. So basically, the combination of these three factors is, I think, is what's driving the demand for broadband services. So if you take a look at the home, which is really the battleground in the end, what carriers are looking to do is own the consumer's experience at the home. That's basic. And if you own that, then you can provide mobile services elsewhere outside the home as well. So the home environment clearly is becoming a lot more richer and more diverse in terms of what people are trying to do. It's not just communications, which is something that we all know, but it's also entertainment services. It is also things like memories with your photos and video and how you want to share all that stuff. And ultimately, it's also about controlling home appliances and things like that. So all four of these factors are expanding and increasing in the home. And the challenge that a service provider has is to own that entire experience in a home. And that way they can make their services very sticky if they can blend all these things very nicely, so the consumer can stick to the value proposition from a particular service provider. So the first and foremost, of course, is in terms of bandwidth. This is what, as I said before, this is the basic foundation. And clearly, a lot has happened in this space, both on the fixed side as well as mobile side. The trend clearly is going towards providing on the order of 100 megabits per second to a home. And you can do that today with most of the fixed technologies, as well as mobile technologies such as 3G, LTE, and so on, which are now moving in a direction where you can roughly get to providing about on an average of 100 megabit per second per user. Now, this fact was also sort of confirmed by looking bottom up from a individual home perspective in terms of how you can get to what kinds of services. So if you look at the mix of IP data, voice, music, games, video, and high-definition TV, you roughly can get very easily to about 100 megabits per second bandwidth by looking at a combination of, let's say, typically 3 televisions using 3 high-def streams and multi-channel audio and email and web and so on. So clearly, I think the trend, whether you look at from a technology perspective or from an application perspective, the goal, I think, over the next few years is to be able to provide, whether it's through a fixed network or a mobile network, roughly on the order of 100 megabit per second to a home. So with that kind of a foundation in place, I think carriers can now layer other aspects. Now, the one that I want to talk about next is mobility. And this is interesting because this has changed the game in how services are delivered. If it were not for wireless devices and wireless networks, and we would have been in a very different world of how communication would take place. So the segment that is really growing very fast is mobile data subscribers. And here I've shown an industry numbers that kind of show around the world in different geographies how rapidly mobile data is growing. And this is really, whether you look at it from a CDMA perspective or HSDPA perspective, talking about a 5-year cumulative aggregate growth rate of 111%, looking into year 2011. And this is a very strong phenomenon. This is the fastest growing segment in the service provider market, the usage of mobile data. And this is really driven by and large, what's happening on the device side. So what I said earlier is the devices and the capability on the devices is extremely critical in enabling these services. None of these services would have happened if the devices did not have a significant amount of intelligence. And this is changing the landscape because, if you look at what iPhone did, the people's choice of choosing a carrier is being driven by what devices are supported on that network. So people are switching to AT&T from Verizon, not because GSM is a better network than CDMA, but because you have iPhone service on AT&T and not on the Verizon network. So this clearly shows the importance that devices have taken on in terms of delivering services and user experience. And the fact that's hidden, which is not that obvious, is even on the network side, the carrier has to support a number of different technologies to deliver these services, like single sign-on, identity management, content charging, and so on. So there is a lot of innovation that happens behind the scenes to keep up with the intelligence in devices. It wouldn't help much if the devices got so much smarter, but the network stayed as a dumb pipe. Then you wouldn't be able to take advantage of the full richness of what you can do. So the network has to keep up with what's happening on the device side. But it's one playing against the other that's sort of driving this innovation curve very rapidly in a direction that's helping the consumers. So I think service providers clearly are a big part of this entire ecosystem or the equation in enabling these kinds of services to happen. And this is an interesting chart that I picked up from an industry research that basically shows, if you look at the growth in handset software, the application software is growing exponentially in terms of what's happening with, these applications that are going in green compared to the normal telephony and communication types of protocol stack. So most mobile devices are getting richer in terms of supporting software that can enable these applications. And this is a very interesting phenomenon. I think this will continue for a while. And you'll see richer and richer set of applications being able to download in an over-the-air fashion as devices become smarter. So you should be able to, just like a PC, be able to download and enable applications on your handset. And this is a very key innovation that's driving our industry. Let me talk about the next theme now, which is what I call convergence. And this is extremely important from a carrier perspective. Carriers are becoming more and more integrated in terms of the network assets that they're acquiring. It's no longer the case that you have a fixed operator and a mobile operator and a broadband operator. These things are all coming together. And that presents some new challenges and new opportunities in that sense. So if you look at a typical service provider, you have a broadband service. You're now beginning to see the early days of IPTV in terms of television services. And of course, you have the wireless side. And there are different services that get delivered on these three different networks. Today, these services are by and large siloed within their own domain. So you have an IPTV service, for instance, that comes over a Fios infrastructure to your widescreen plasma TV, and you have a different TV service that comes to your mobile device. And of course, you can go and watch other kinds of video services over broadband. And these are not really tied together. I think the model that service providers are moving towards is to drive this notion of service layer convergence, where services come from a single converged core. So the idea is that any service can be delivered to any device. The notion is to create a service once in your network and to be able to deliver it everywhere over any device and access network. Break down these silos where you no longer have to create services multiple times in different networks. And the final point is, not only you do this, but also you create stickiness by enhancing the user experience. I'll give you two examples of what I see happening, and these things are actually being rolled out in pockets of the world today, so these are not something that is very futuristic. One is this notion of personal TV anywhere. There are carriers around the world that I've seen dominantly in Asia, where you can sign up for a TV service with a set of channels that you want to, and then you can access it not only at your home, but also on your mobile device, as well as your broadband TV, just by a single sign-on type mechanism. So you get authenticated, and then you immediately have access to your channels anywhere that over any access network. More than just TV, you can also provide through web portals some form of interactivity and end-user control. And now you can also start to blend more of the social network type phenomenon with your personal TV type of channels. So one example that I saw is this notion of personal TV social networking portal where you can not only watch your channels, but you can share history, tag channels, review, comment, rate, sling these channels to your friends, and tie them with your address book presence, messaging alerts, and so on and so forth. So now you can blend a whole bunch of different communications experience while watching video and TV. And these kinds of services are actually appearing in some of the countries where the infrastructure has become quite advanced. Another example is this notion of converts your experience at home. Your mobile device is what you use to interact with people, and your TV screen is where you really like to watch the high quality content. And so what carriers are trying to do is blend these things together or mash them up in a way that it creates stickiness. So you can now interact using your mobile phone, interact with your TV, and create a very interactive, rich experience using your handset and your TV. And I'll give you two examples of what's happening. One is this notion of what is called video share, which is essentially a notion that you can capture and share video from a handset onto a TV screen. So if you're at home and your wife is out in a soccer game with your kid and is capturing it on your mobile phone, then you can actually stream it and connect it and present it as a video share experience on your large screen TV at home. And you can present it as a session, and if you'd like to watch, then you can accept it, and it will immediately pop in a picture-in-picture type screen, and you can watch it. If you don't want to watch it, you can send it to a PVR, or it will record on your set-top box, and then you can watch it later. So these kinds of services where you're blending your television experience or your IPTV experience with your mobile user-generated content will now create stickiness. So if you have a Verizon phone service or a wireless service and a Verizon Fios TV, you can get a service like this. So that creates a stickiness for a home and an incentive to buy a Verizon phone and a Verizon TV as opposed to an AT&T phone and a Verizon IPTV, which will not give you that same experience. So this is an example where you can create stickiness. Another one, of course, is to provide a live chat service using SMS. So if you're watching a soccer game and you want to share and chat with your friends, you can now do that just by texting to your friend and having that open up on your television screen as well. And you can have the same experience in terms of interactivity on your big screen instead of just having a text experience on your cell phone. So this again creates a richer user experience. And to enable all these things, by the way, there's a lot of things that have to happen in the network. This is not just a model where you can bring these siloed services together where the network is just a dump pipe. You need to do some things behind in the carrier network to make these services happen. So that leads me to this final topic, which is what I call personalization. And this is an area where there is some work going on with, we are working with a couple of large carriers in terms of how to create services that are highly personalized. The carriers feel that since they have a unique relationship with the subscriber because they own the subscriber and they have the subscriber data, they can now leverage that in more innovative ways to create more personalized experience. So one example that I want to pick up is this notion of a digital lifestyle. So if you go back in a very rudimentary sense, the communication-oriented paradigm, which is where the carrier started, was essentially a model where you created person-to-person mass market services. These were highly non-personalized and subscription-based, so you can do things like voice over IP or text messaging and so on. And then the internet came along and basically created this information-oriented model where you can now use services on the internet, which is basically companies like Google and others, which are very good at organizing information and presenting it to users using ad-based models and so on. So this created a paradigm which was very information-centric. And with social networking, that value chain moved up to providing what we call community-oriented services, where people can now participate and share. And a lot of the Web 2.0 types of things that we talk about are essentially in this community-oriented model of a digital lifestyle. So the evolution of this chain, where the carriers, I think, can add a lot of value, is what I call personality-oriented services, where a carrier, because of their unique relationship that they have with the end user, they can actually build a digital personality of a consumer in their network because they are in the middle of every transaction or every interaction that a subscriber is doing. And they can now capture your personality as a consumer when you're at home, as a father, as a wife, as a husband, or at work when you are a boss, you're an employee, and you're trying to work with partners and so on, and what your hobbies are, and what you do at work, what your tastes are, and so on. And you can, by creating additional signaling layer intelligence in your infrastructure, you can start to build services based on this idea of personality. So personality means preferences, profile, presence, relationships, contacts, communities, etc. And the services now get driven for the subscriber, not just by the subscriber. So the network can offer you things based on what your likes and dislikes are and be able to present to you an information at a much more meta level, which is highly concentrated and highly relevant. The network can learn, evolve, and adapt based on how you do things using the network, and then find for you the right match of products, services, venue, time, people, and information. So this is, to do all this requires a much more intelligent infrastructure than what is available today. And let me just say a few words about the infrastructure implications. So if you look at how carriers are building their infrastructure, there are essentially two layers. One is the access layer, which is all going to be either fixed broadband or mobile broadband. And you can have devices that can attach either way. So this is all about providing flexibility and choice. In the network, it's all about efficiency and building these intelligence in a highly efficient manner. So the idea is to build one core network that can tie to multiple access technologies. And the real secret sauce is this thing, what we call the session control layer, which sits between the application layer and the packet core. This is what allows applications to be delivered to any device over any access network and be able to create additional value propositions around enhanced user experience and so on. So this is the layer where Sonus is very focused in terms of helping carriers build the next version of it. So session control is not just having a SIP infrastructure. For voice over IP, it was all around SIP. But SIP to me is a very simple notion of a session. So if I look at the larger context of what is the new paradigm that we need to introduce for session control, to me, it's really going step beyond where the internet and the telecom domains are today. In the telecom world, sessions today are based on simple calls. So you can have a SIP session between two parties and you can make a call, you can go to voicemail, you can add a party, you can drop a party and things like that. In the internet domain, by and large, the sessions are based on transactions. So you do a transaction, you do a search, you buy something, and the network is able to track these sessions. In the next generation network, I think what you need to introduce is more context and more persistence and more relevance in how these sessions are created and managed, and because what you want to do with these sessions is much more than what you can do today in the telecom and the internet domain. So this is what I call the new middleware of the carrier network, this intelligent session control layer, which will provide a northbound API to enable service creation in the most flexible and intelligent fashion. And in the southbound fashion, it optimizes your use of network resources. So this next generation session control, in my opinion, will have attributes of context, persistence, relevance, capturing your persona, interactivity, learning and adaptation, and by the way, from a carrier OpEx and CapEx perspective, to provide quality of service and bandwidth management. And I think if you can do all of this effectively, then this is where I think the carriers are going to add value. So then it's not just providing the transport at the bottom layer, but I think carriers will enable a whole new set of applications and services, not just doing it themselves, but having a lot of third parties and other companies do it, but they cannot do it without building an intelligent session control, which becomes a new middleware of their network infrastructure. So this is where I think innovation will happen. This is where companies like Sonus are very much focused. So watch these things unfold over the next 5 to 10 years. This is where I think the future is. So thank you very much.